You need to take action, and you're about to get real-world information and insight for fixing your career. This is the Take Back Your Career podcast with your host, Adam Fullerton.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Take Back Your Career podcast, which is dedicated to helping professionals find happiness, fulfillment, and financial security in the work that you do so that you can avoid that feeling of misery, that sense of being stuck and dreading your workday every day you wake up. And on today's episode, we're going to talk all about resumes, the interview process, and how to crush it, and what our listeners can learn from our guest's own journey after she learned that her dream job wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. And to do this on today's episode, we have on with us Jess Smith, who is the owner of Jess Smith Career Coaching, where she uses her recruiting insight and her love of discovering who people truly are to help job seekers identify their calling and land careers that they love. Jess, like I said, comes to us with a background in recruiting for a large organization where she personally has interviewed over 1,000 candidates for a variety of roles and has reviewed thousands of resumes, which means you have quite the perspective and will be a great asset to have on today's podcast, because I'm sure our listeners will love to know how to impress a recruiter, Jess, so that they can get to the next step in the interview process, how to make sure their resume isn't holding them back, and of course, how to crush the interview process, like I said. So with all of that said, Jess, thank you for doing this. Thank you for being on this podcast. I truly appreciate you fitting this into your schedule. I know you're busy, and so I want to make sure that we're using this time to the fullest for the benefit of our listeners. And so we have a bunch of topics on for today, a bunch of questions for you. And again, I just appreciate you doing this and want to say thanks for being on and ask how you're doing, like I like to ask every single guest we have on.
Hi, Adam. Thank you so much for having me. Super, super excited to be here today. I'm doing great, and I can't wait to chat about all things job search.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you for doing this. And what I want to do, Jess, I want to kick off this episode with your story. I know we talked about this in the past when you and I first connected, and I loved the story because it was essentially about how you thought you had landed your dream job, which I know our listeners face all the time. They think they're going to land their dream job, or they thought they landed their dream job, and then it doesn't end up being what they thought it was going to be. So I would love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about your story and how that might have happened for you, and what made you maybe make some pivots and transitions in your own career that ultimately led to where you are today, being a business owner and, of course, a career coach for others. And again, what our listeners can learn from your path and maybe some frustrations or reasons on why you made changes.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for asking. So I'm going to take you back to when I was in college. I initially went as an undecided major, right? Like many of us. And I really wasn't sure what I wanted at first. And there's a lot of pressure in college to kind of figure out, okay, what major am I going to pick, right? This is what I'm going to be doing. And so I eventually came to the conclusion that I wanted to get a degree in retail, merchandising, and management, which is very, very specific. So I thought that I wanted to be a buyer at a large retail corporation. So for anyone who's not familiar, buyers are responsible for what products end up in the stores that you go and buy. Thought that would be really cool. I had a great time in college. I was top of all of my classes, right? And so I spent 5 years really working towards this goal of getting into the retail world as a buyer. So I was really, really excited after college when I landed a job before I even graduated, which was awesome. And it was at Walmart's corporate office, the largest retailer. And I was told by all of my professors, if you go here, you're going to manage so much money, you can do whatever you want after that, right? So it was a really, really exciting time to be moving in this direction. So I picked up my life. I'm from Minnesota. I moved down to Arkansas, which was a new experience for me. I had never been before, and started my new dream job, right? Or so I thought. And what I realized once I got there was that it wasn't my dream job. And the frustrating part of that was that I had worked so hard to get there. I had put in so much time, so much effort only to get there and realize I actually hate this. I hated my job. I was not good at it, you guys. It was really bad. I was in like a cohort type of thing with other people. So he's still one of my best friends today. He was like the top of our class, and I swear I had to be somewhere near the bottom. So just like that contrast too was so painful for me. And so a lot of my career was about numbers. It was a numbers heavy job. So I was running around with this crazy Excel spreadsheet that I didn't know how to read. people were asking me questions about it. I was freaking out every day. And after 9 months, I was like, you know what? My career is just not supposed to be this hard. It's not supposed to be this painful. It's not supposed to be this upsetting. I was at the point where I was like calling my mom after work every day crying, right? Because I was in so much pain around this career path. So it was at that point that I really started my first career clarity journey. I knew that I was on the wrong career path and I needed to make a change and a pivot into something else. So it was at that point I started doing a bunch of exploration work. I started getting really curious about who I am as a person. I think that's a key part of clarity, is really getting introspective. I did a ton of informational interviews. And from there, I came to the conclusion that I wanted to get into recruiting. So wanted to get into recruiting because it was so much more aligned with my personal skills and my strengths. And that was really the problem with my career, as my first role was an analyst on this buyer career path, right? It was that it didn't play to my strengths. It's not a bad career path. It was just a bad career path for me. It wasn't the right fit for me in particular. So wanted to get into recruiting. I've always known that I'm more of a people person. I have a freakish ability to remember people's names and their stories. And so it was really going to be an opportunity for me to utilize all of these skills that I'm really good at. So that was how I decided on recruiting. Ended up at Salesforce. It is a Fortune 500 tech company in the Bay Area. So I moved out to San Francisco and I absolutely loved it. I had so much fun in recruiting. It was so awesome to feel excited about the work that I was doing, to feel good at the work that I was doing finally, and to really just feel like I was using my natural strengths and abilities. So I spent 4 years in the recruiting world, like you mentioned at the beginning, Adam, and had a great time. But it was probably around year 3 that I felt like I'd mastered a lot of skills and was starting to feel like, okay, what's my next thing? I don't think I'm going to be in recruiting necessarily for the rest of my career. And so I went through my second clarity process at this point, getting really curious about what do I want next? What is it going to look like? So did more informational interviews, right? Highly recommend them. And this time I really kind of struggled to find a role inside of my company. I love my company. Company was a great fit. So I wanted to find something internal that was going to play off of this desire that I had to help people on a deeper level and to work with people in a one-on-one capacity. So I was like talking to all these different teams, trying to see what was going to fit with that. And nothing seemed to align with that. And I eventually had a director at my company, which I so appreciate. She said to me, Jess, what you want to do is not here. You need to leave and go start your own business. And I was like, wow, that had never been on the table for me. I never thought about being an entrepreneur before. So it was a new idea for me. And the more that I explored it and researched it and learned more about how I could help people with their careers, right? I could utilize all of my recruiting knowledge. I could have the one-on-one conversations that I wanted to have. That was like my biggest thing. That was really the driving force in wanting to get into entrepreneurship and making the switch to becoming a career coach.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's such a great story, in my opinion. I think it's awesome to hear stories in which people have made pivots after not finding success or happiness in their current job or the path that they were on, because again, I think it's something that our listeners face themselves all of the time. And so I want to ask you then, Jess, when you made your pivot, did you feel like you were taking a step backwards, going from your dream job, or so you thought, to something that was completely different and wasn't originally on your radar or, in your thoughts?
Yeah. So for me, and I think everyone's path is unique. For me, I was still pretty early on in my career overall. And so making the move from being an analyst over into recruiting, I definitely started in an entry-level position. I think there were probably other ways that I could have gone about that. Like I could have gone the agency route, which is like a fast track in the recruiting world. So there are lots of different ways to get to where you're going, I guess is my point. But for me, I was really excited to learn. I was really excited to master all of the pieces of recruiting. And so for me, it was okay to start in more of an entry-level position. I think for other people who are maybe a little bit later in their careers, there are different ways to get in, right? And I think when you're making a pivot, one of the big things that you have to focus on is networking is key. So I have networked my way into every job that I have ever gotten. And I think that's really a way to land in a place that is a good fit for you with where you're at in your career.
Yeah, we talk about networking all the time and the power of networking and what, spending 5, 10, 15 minutes a day on LinkedIn or other networks can do for you in your career. And we've heard, everybody's heard before, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And so I think just not only improving what you know, but improving who you know and what they have access to, it's only going to help you from both sides of the spectrum, I guess. What I want to ask you before kind of jumping into resumes and the interview process and, again, impressing recruiters, I want to ask you, it sounds like you said that you had a conversation with your director and that person said, what you want just doesn't exist here. I would love to learn what that process was like. How did you, I guess, bring that up? How did you go from, this is what I do, I want to explore the opportunities within the organization that you were at, and then learn, again, that just wasn't there for you? I feel like a lot of people are very hesitant to have conversations with upper management or their bosses or whatever because, fear of what are they going to say? What are going to be the repercussions of just saying, I'm not happy with what I'm doing or it doesn't align with what I'm interested in? How did you approach that conversation?
Yeah, totally. So I think even pre-conversation is having a conversation with yourself. So I really think that the clarity process starts with getting really clear on who you are, what you like, and what you don't like. So that was really where I started both times, when I was in the analyst role and when I was making my recruiting career evolution there. I started off with saying, okay, what aspects of my role do I love? Which aspects am I really excited about? And which aspects are sucking the life out of me, right? Which aspects are not fun for me? So I'll give you an analyst example because this one was like pretty blatant for me because I didn't like the job, right?
Sure.
So when I was an analyst, I started keeping track of how I was feeling every day. How am I feeling? What am I doing? How am I feeling? What am I doing? And so I started noticing I am feeling frustrated. I am feeling drained of energy. I am feeling insignificant when I'm going to these sales meetings and people are asking me about the profit margins and like, what's the forecasted number of t-shirts we're going to sell, right? I hated it. But I also noticed, on the other hand, that I loved opportunities to work with the intern on our team, which was actually not even part of my job description, right? That was just kind of something extra that I got to do. So make sure you're paying attention to those pieces as well. But I loved mentoring her. I loved giving her advice. I loved helping her find people to connect with. So those were some of the things that I identified for myself was advice giving, love helping people with their careers. I love being a connector. I love having conversations with new people. So for me, it really started with that. What do I love? And from there, I was like, okay, where can I find this, right? There has to be a job that encompasses these things that I enjoy. So I went out, we'll start with the analyst one, and had conversations with a ton of different teams. So I talked to the product development team. I talked to the trend forecasting team. I talked to the HR team. I talked to so many different people. And in all of those conversations that I had, I was looking for those pieces that I enjoy. So really it started with me, and then I would just go ask people about it. Like, what opportunities do you have to mentor people and give advice in this role? And sometimes they would be like, no, that's not a part of my job.
It doesn't exist here.
That doesn't exist, right? And I'm like, okay, maybe that's not the path for me, right? And that's what ended up happening when I was in the recruiting world. And this conversation with the director, I was on such a mission to find a position where I could coach people one-on-one. And so I was asking, she worked in talent development, right? So I was like, oh, talent development has to be the place where this is happening. And what I learned was that the talent development team is focused on serving 30,000 employees at the same time. Everything they do is focused on scale. It's not focused on one-to-one, right? That's what the managers are for of each of the teams. So that was, when we could have that honest conversation where I was like, where can I find this? That was where she was able to say, look, what you want isn't here. And I'm sure she's definitely a a powerful leader for being able to say that, right? You should leave our company. Not everyone's going to say that. I got very lucky and I'm very grateful to her. But I think it really comes down to identifying what you want and then going out there and asking the questions to see where you can find it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I want to emphasize again that a lot of our listeners might feel intimidated or might not have the best relationship with their boss or manager. So my question is, what do our listeners do if they don't feel comfortable or simply don't want to talk to their manager as they, go through this clarity process or the information gathering process?
Yeah. So one thing I will say is that a lot of the conversations that I had were not with my manager. They were with all sorts of different teams. So this is essentially informational interviewing. I had no idea that's what it was called when I first started doing it. It was kind of just my natural instinct, like, I'm going to go talk to people, right? I'm a people person. I was utilizing that skill. But you can have informational interviews with anyone at the company, right? So when I was talking to the trends team, like my manager had no idea that I was necessarily doing that, right? So I think if you are intimidated by having that conversation directly with your manager, or maybe you don't have the most supportive manager, right? Not everyone's a great manager. That's like the reality of the world.
That's very true.
Yeah, you can kind of go on your own clarity journey first, right? Go figure it out for yourself. Talk to other people in the organization and even outside of your organization. LinkedIn has 1 billion people that you can go talk to and learn about their careers, right? So have some of those conversations and figure out what you want first. And then I think maybe that's a way to even approach your manager, right? Is to say, hey, I've done this reflection. I've had a bunch of conversations. This is kind of what I'm thinking moving forward. Is that a possibility? Is maybe a better way to approach it.
Right. It's sort of doing your due diligence first, I guess, and seeing what's out there and what the opportunities are and where your interests lie. And then when the time is right, you can feel more comfortable going to your manager to see what the options are. And like we discussed a lot on this podcast, it also gives you the power to take action and pursue avenues that might not have been available to you instead of waiting for a promotion or a job to pop up, because as we all know, that could simply mean that you're playing the passive kind of waiting game instead of being proactive in your efforts. So Jess, then once the person has maybe identified a new opportunity within the organization or outside of the organization and somewhere else altogether, maybe the next step in the process after having informational interviews and networking is to, of course, update your resume, right? But I recently read a post of yours on LinkedIn that said that the first thing you should do when starting to write your resume is to not start with your resume at all. So I would just love for you to expand on that and help our listeners navigate that part of the journey in their career. So what did you mean by that post exactly?
Yeah, this is a great question. So what my post was referencing is that I think one of the big mistakes job seekers make when they sit down to work on their resume, like I said, is they start with their resume. Instead of thinking forwards, they're thinking backwards. They think, what have I done? What has my experience been? What are my accomplishments, right? And they're thinking about it as a comprehensive recap of everything that they've ever done. Which the problem with that is that you're not thinking about the future. You're not thinking about where you're trying to go, and you're not thinking about your audience. So your resume is a document that is being sent out to an audience, these recruiters, these hiring managers, right? And you want to cater your message and the story that you're telling in your resume to the audience. And so what the audience is talking about is their job description, right? That is the key to everything, is starting with that job description and seeing, what do they want to hear? What do they want to know about me? What problems do they need solved that I could potentially help them with? And so I would really encourage people, when you think about your resume, start with the job description and do some forward thinking instead of backwards thinking, right? You really want to be in alignment with what that audience wants. And when you can communicate in their language and communicate that you can solve the problems that they have, when you can communicate that you have the skills that they need, that's when you start getting noticed by recruiters, companies, and hiring managers.
It's like reverse engineering it essentially, right? See what they're looking for and then tailor your resume and everything you put on it to solve those needs, of course, based on your experience, but also the skills and the things that you have that can help them kind of solve the problem or fill in the gap that they're looking for, right? That's
Yep.
essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So start with that. And then of course you're going to have other space, right, that you need to fill in. And that's when you can pull up some other cool stuff that you've done maybe, right? But you really want to start with, where am I going? What do they need to hear from me? What are they going to be most excited to learn about me?
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful way of framing what a resume is. And in my words, I feel like it's more about telling a story of you and your accomplishments, to the audience, which is again the recruiter, the hiring manager. And instead of simply listing off a bunch of accomplishments, it should be about listing off accomplishments and skills that fit what the company is looking for, and making sure you're, of course, tailoring it in a way that will bridge the gap that the organization has, and is of course why they're looking to hire someone in the first place. So that said, just after someone has tailored their resume, next is the application and interview process. And like I said earlier, with all of your recruiting experience, I would love to know what specifically our listeners need to be on the lookout for. What are some mistakes that you've seen in the past, and ultimately, how do they impress a recruiter or a hiring manager?
Yeah. So some of the little mistakes that I notice people making throughout the interview process, I think the first one is a super classic mistake that we kind of forget about, but it's just talking too much in your interview. This happened all the time. I interviewed so many people, and I know that it's a nervous habit, right? We're nervous for the interview, and one of our nervous ticks sometimes is that we just keep talking and we don't know when to stop. But it's really important to gain control of that, because what happens is when you show up to an interview and you're talking for 10 minutes of the 30-minute conversation, you come off as totally lacking self-awareness. You've just taken up the 10 minutes of a 1/3 of our conversation, right? With telling me your whole life story since you were in college or high school or whatever it is, right? So that was something that I noticed a lot with people, was just talking too much, not knowing when to stop talking. It was even I would sometimes have candidates who would give me a great answer, and then I, as the recruiter, it's almost like you're checking boxes in your mind, okay, yep, they answered that. They've got this. Great. I had checked the box in my mind, but then they just kept talking for another minute, to the point where I'm kind of oh my God, we're now in the deterioration phase, right? You were on a high, you did awesome. And now that you just won't stop talking, you're totally not self-aware. And so now I'm starting to pull back, right? And take steps away instead of taking steps towards you and being more excited. So I would say that's a pretty classic one, but definitely a common one is talking too much, for one.
Yeah, I could certainly see how sometimes maybe less is more, but I feel like if listeners are told to talk less, they'll simply go from one extreme to the other. So how do you know, or how do our listeners figure out what the right balance is, I guess, so that, like you said, they aren't making the hiring manager or recruiter go from, this person's nailing it to this person's talking themselves into a hole, I guess?
Yeah. So I would say practice is key. Just simply practicing, right? Practice stopping speaking, right? I was working on this with a client just last week, and the end of her interview answers, because we were doing mock interview questions together, she would just kind of trail off at the end, and it wasn't even clear to me when she was done speaking. So I would say practicing stopping speaking, for one, right? Give yourself some time frames too for answering questions, I think is a great way to practice. So I'm going to answer this question in 2 minutes, right? I'm going to answer this question in maybe 3 minutes. Depending on the question, I think it is okay to talk a little bit longer if it's something that requires a longer response, but I don't think you should ever be talking for more than 5 minutes at a time at the very most, right? At that point, it's starting to get to be too much. And you want it to be a conversation. If you're talking for 5 whole minutes, where are they getting to be part of the conversation, right? You need to leave those breaks for them to be able to jump in. And I think you can remember that they are able to ask for more information, right? As a recruiter, I'm looking for certain things. And if you've touched on the main part and I want to know more, I'll ask you about that. I'll give you an opportunity to do that.
Right. Remembering that it's intended to be a conversation is, again, a great way to frame the discussion or interview instead of thinking of it more in terms of I guess, a question and answer session. Because like you said earlier, you have to remember that the people across from you are humans too, and they're looking to have a conversation about your accomplishments, your resume and experience, rather than this very dry, kind of long-winded response, format where which is what we often think about when we hear the word interview. So what's the next tip you have on your list then for our listeners, and how can they, increase their odds again of improving or impressing a recruiter or a manager and making it through the interview process itself?
Yeah. Another little thing that I noticed, which was interesting. So I would review resumes, right? And then invite people to do an interview with me and have a conversation. And sometimes I would have candidates, when I looked at their resume, I was like, okay, like they're not awesome on paper, but I'm going to give them a shot, right? Like, let's reach out. We'll call them. And then I would get on the phone with this candidate and they would start telling me all these amazing things about themselves. And I was always shocked because I was like, why was this not on your resume? Right. So it kind of goes back to what we talked about before. And I think one of the big examples from my time, I worked with a lot of account executives, so a lot of salespeople. And sometimes they wouldn't put their results on their resume. This is why we need to have those results in there, right? Give me some numbers, some concrete things to go off of. Especially in sales, they wouldn't put their numbers in their resume. And then I would get them on the phone and they would tell me that they absolutely crushed their quota every single year. And I'm like, wow, well, now my interest in you just skyrocketed, right? Like, I wish I would have known this before. So I would say, put those things in your resume that are really awesome about you. Make sure you're highlighting your accomplishments, your experiences, I almost said experiments, and the results that you've gotten, right? That's important to recruiters.
Well, I think one of the powers or the things that people can tap into working with individuals like yourself or other, resume writers is obviously a lot of people aren't experienced in writing resumes. It's not like you do it a whole lot in your career, or hopefully you don't have to, but working with career coaches and experts, but giving them this information so that they can kind of tailor it. They can say, this is what you need to put, this is what you should put, so that you're not just kind of throwing everything in there and hoping and praying that it kind of fits, I guess, what the recruiter is looking for. Because again, I think a lot of people they'll go one extreme or the other, and they'll put none of their results, and they'll just put a lot of, personality traits and things that they're good at, but then they're missing out on the results piece, and then they'll go the opposite direction and not talk about who they are as a person, which I think is important as a recruiter. And you tell me, I think it's still important to understand how this person from a personality perspective will fit into the role and into the organization.
Yeah, completely. And I think this is another little mistake that I saw people make. So I'm glad you bring this up. I think it really matters how you answer the phone. I think it really matters how the conversation starts, because this would happen a lot too, that I would call people for our scheduled interview time. They know I'm going to be calling them, right? And they would answer the phone and they would say, hello. And they would sound confused. They would sound like I had called them at a bad time. And I'm a human too, right? As a recruiter. So I'm over here now feeling like, oh my gosh, is this like a bad time to talk? Do they not want to talk to me? Are
you inconveniencing them?
Totally. I'm like, I'm confused now. What's happening here? And it just kicks off the conversation on a really weird footing. So I think that, to circle back to your point, like, your personality and the energy that you bring to the table, to these interviews, is really important. The recruiters want to feel like they're making a connection with you, right? They want to be able to see themselves like saying hi to you in the hall, or like working with you, or getting referrals from you in the future, right? And so I would say, like, show up to your interviews with an upbeat tone. It can be a conversation, right? I think this is another thing with nerves, where it's like, oh, I better not like say anything fun, right? Because it might be weird. But I loved that personally as a recruiter, when candidates would say, oh, I just went on this super nice walk with my dog in the park. I live next to whatever. I live next to Central Park, right? Something small and sweet like that is perfect, because then it gives me an opportunity, if I want, to jump in and say, oh my gosh, Central Park, that's so cool. Like, I haven't been to New York. I really want to go. And those were my favorite conversations that I got to have, where there was a little bit of that personality up front. I could see what this person was like as a person. And it really helped build rapport and connection with them. And it set me up to believe that the rest of the conversation was going to go well. I now assume that it's going to be an enjoyable conversation instead of assuming, oh my gosh, they sound confused and like I'm annoying them. This is probably not going to be a good conversation, right? So I think how you answer the phone and how you show up in your energy and how you start off the conversation is really important.
Totally. It's kind of like having a bad taste in your mouth and having that be in the back of your mind from the moment you meet the person. And then, that again is simply because you picked up the phone and didn't put in the effort or the energy level that the recruiter was looking for or even, expecting, especially if this is truly a job or a position or even a company that the person is apparently, looking at and wants to work at. It doesn't make much sense to come in with kind of a dull or a lack of energy. You're just going to ruin your chances probably pretty quickly, in my opinion. So once someone's on the phone or, in the interview, Jess, how do they make sure they're asking the right questions themselves as a candidate and making sure that it's a conversation like we talked about, a few minutes ago?
Yeah. So I would start off by saying that prepare the questions ahead of time, right? Do not do them on the fly. So have those listed out. And I always like to prepare my questions ahead of time and then rank them in priority order. Because when you go into an interview, you never really know how it's going to go. They could give you 1 minute at the end to ask questions. Maybe you get to ask one question at the end, right? Or this happened once, and this is so rare, but I have been through an interview where it was all me asking questions, right? They didn't have any questions for me. It was totally conversational. They wanted to answer all of my questions about the company. So you have to be prepared for that, right? You have to have questions prepared so that you're able to fill that space. And that's where the prioritization really comes in handy, is that if you've got them ranked and your most important question is listed on your sheet that you bring with you, right? Because it's okay to bring a notebook or like a nice notepad to your interviews. I want to give people permission to do that. If you have that listed as number one, then at least you got the most important one answered, right? And you're not like looking at all the different questions you have planned out. So I really think plan the questions ahead of time, rank them in order of priority. And then when it comes to what questions to ask, I always like to ask my clients, what do you want to know? We always think that there's like something that we should be asking. And yeah, there are the basics, which are good. But what do you really want to know? Because you're interviewing the company too. And so what would you need to know from them to decide if this is a good fit for you or not? What are you not able to find online about this company that would help you decide if you want to work for the company or not? So I really think that's a great starting point, is to get curious with yourself, right? What do you need to know to make a decision?
Yeah, this is your time as a candidate to ask those questions to make sure that, again, this is the right fit for you based on what you're truly looking for and the needs that you have, so that you again, don't pick the wrong company or just assume that it's going to be a good fit in terms of culture or the environment. You have to kind of deal with it if you take that job, and you want to make sure it's the right job and the right company and environment for you. Jess, I want to ask you, and I'm not sure how to, I guess, best word this, but did you ever run into any instances in which maybe people lied on their resume just so that they could get a job, or maybe inflated their experience or accomplishments just to get a job? And my point here, I guess, is to understand how far someone should, push to make themselves kind of stand out on their resume and, in your interview or I guess in their interview, and really how far is too much when talking about your accomplishments on your resume or, again, in the interview itself.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that there weren't a lot of experiences with people where I could tell that they were lying. Maybe they were lying to me and I didn't know it, right? But I will say that it is a fine line between being confident and being arrogant. And I think that that is definitely something to keep an eye on. I worked with a lot of people in the sales world. Like I mentioned earlier, I love salespeople. So I will caveat this with that. I love salespeople. However, a lot of them are really confident. A lot of them are go-getters. A lot of them can be kind of aggressive, right? And some of them came across as totally arrogant. And for my company that I worked at, that was not going to fly. So there was a fine line between, being confident in the work that you've done and your achievements and your results, and just taking it completely over the top and being totally full of yourself, right? Like, we can feel that energy. And it's all about the energetics of how you're showing up. Is there a humbleness there or not? Like, I can tell if that humble piece is missing. I will say that if you do lie up front and it comes out later, that's totally going to screw you over. So that is the risk that you run, right?
Yeah.
I think there was one time in my recruiting experience that we had found out someone wasn't totally truthful, and it just totally broke the trust between the team and them, and they ended up kicking them out of the process, right? So I really don't think it's worth it to over exaggerate your experience.
Sure. And I think too, just setting up realistic expectations for both parties, because a lot of times I feel like, and I could be wrong, you're the recruiter, but there's opportunities out there and someone say, oh, this is an opportunity that's maybe just a little bit more experience than I really have. So I'm going to kind of, inflate what I've done or stretch what I've done so I can get into that type of position. So maybe that's a question I want to ask you. How do you balance that as someone looking at an opportunity that might be just a bit out of your experience or the range that you're comfortable with? You want to grow, of course, as someone in their career, and our listeners want to grow, but maybe they don't have, something says you need 5 years experience. Maybe you have 3 or 4. How do you bridge that gap and stay true and honest to what you've done, but also say, I can still do this, or I can grow into this type of position?
Yeah, I don't think it's about inflating your experience. I think it's more about focusing in on the right experience. And so this circles us back to starting with the job description, right? And job descriptions are not hard and fast things, right? We think that they are, but they're not. So it's like they might be asking for 5 years, but if you show up and you've got 3 years and you can explain all of, your awesome experience, and that really touches on the problems that they need you to solve, recruiting's a gray area, right? There's always going to be like a little bit of flex here and there. So I would say that rather than inflating, it's more about just really focusing in on the right things and what they want to hear, and really making sure that you highlight that experience in your interview.
Right. I guess I never realized that, 5 years doesn't really mean you need 5 years experience, but rather it's about what they probably expect you to have accomplished in, 5 years time. And if you have 3 years, but have what the recruiter or the hiring manager is looking for, then it probably doesn't really matter the number of years or experience that you have, or at least maybe it doesn't matter as much. And that goes back to our discussion on knowing your audience and tailoring your resume in a way that highlights that, and again, drives or delivers, I should say, on what the person is looking for.
Yeah. And I mean, if you can network your way into an interview, right? If you can just get in there and then you have an awesome personality and you have an awesome attitude and you totally vibe with the team, that goes really far. That goes really, really far. I had a client recently, and they actually told her after they made her the offer, they said, you're definitely not the most qualified candidate, right? But we really liked you. We really liked your attitude. We really liked the way that you showed up. So that was really, really cool to hear how that was the defining factor where she got the role over other people who had more specific experience that was more related than hers.
Right. And that's the power of networking and what it can do for you, and why it's something our listeners need to continue doing if they're out there doing it already. And if not, why they need to get on LinkedIn as one option and start networking, because it can truly help provide opportunities above and beyond just what you know. So the last thing I wanted to bring up and ask you about on today's episode, Jess, is your thoughts on which questions really during interviewing or the interview process our listeners need to make sure they're ready to answer and answer correctly, or if not, they could possibly miss out on the opportunity altogether. What are some of those questions, again, based on your experience, that our listeners should be prepared for and ready to answer?
Yeah, so I think there are 3 questions that you should always be prepared for whenever you're picking up the phone for an interview. And I think it is, tell me about yourself. Why are you interested in this role? And why are you looking for a new position? I think those are 3 questions that you 100% should be able to nail. because you are in control of those three questions, right? You are in control of your story. You are in control of why you're looking for a new job. And you are in control of dictating why you want this role, right? Articulating why you want this role. And so I think those are really important questions for people to focus on. I think they're really common questions that get asked. I think they're ones that people stumble with, especially tell me about yourself. Can be really tricky for people. So highly recommend practicing that one out loud ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that's sort of like the easiest, questions are the hardest questions, right? Because you think those will be easy to answer and come naturally, but then you get nervous or your mind is racing and you stumble your way through answering again, and should be, what it should be an easy question. So like you just said, Jess, this is just another way our listeners can prepare for an interview and make sure that they cover their bases and don't struggle with some of the most important parts of the interview process, and of course help their chances of making it onto the next part of the interview process and ultimately improve their odds of landing the job that they're after. So with all of that said, that's actually everything we had on for today's for today's topics, and I wanted to say, of course, thank you, Jess, for being on and helping not only myself learn, but our listeners learn as they navigate their career one day at a time. And I wanted to also ask you to please let our listeners know where they can find you and follow you and engage with you if they're looking for, one-on-one help or other tidbits and insights that you're sharing. Where can they, of course, work with you, and where can they follow along, I guess?
Yeah, so the best place to follow me is definitely on LinkedIn. I am sharing career clarity and job search strategies 5 times a week over there. So you can find me at Jess Smith Coaching. And then also my website is just jesssmithcoaching.com.
Perfect. Well, like I like to say, we'll make sure that all of that information is in the show notes so that our listeners can be certain to find you. So again, Jess, thanks for doing this. I truly appreciate it. All the information you shared today was invaluable as far as I'm concerned, and I know our listeners will appreciate it. So one more time, thank you for doing this. And I want to, of course, give you the last word for the podcast. And before doing so, just want to say, guys, thanks for listening today. Remember, we release a new episode every single Monday, and the point of it is to help you guys realize that Mondays shouldn't suck and that you're in charge of the career path that you're on. So thank you again, Jess. And like I said, I'm going to give you the last word. Anything else you want to tell our listeners, feel free.
Yeah. So the last thing that I will leave all of you with is just that we each live one very special life. This is your one very special life, and it is happening right now. And you get to choose what happens with that life. So use that as your motivation. If you're in a career that you hate, do something about it. You have control over that, right? And I know it's not easy. I know it's potentially a long path, right? It can take a while, but it's all going to be worth it in the end. So use that as your motivation, that this is your one special life that's happening right now. So thanks so much, Adam. Thanks for letting me share.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jess, again for doing this. Thank you guys for listening. And that's today's episode. I hope you guys appreciate it. And I, of course, will, as I always like to say, see you guys on next week's episode. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Take Back Your Career podcast with your host, Adam Fullerton, the podcast dedicated to giving you expert advice and actionable ideas so that you can achieve real results and finally take back your career. Like what you heard in today's episode? Consider leaving a 5-star review and visiting takebackyourcareerpodcast.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify for more episodes. And remember, Mondays shouldn't suck, and neither should finding help. Thanks for listening to Take Back Your Career podcast.